I began my career at Salem Dunkin' Donuts on August 11th, 2015, working for manager under the franchise. Being that I had 2 years' work experience already for another Dunkin' Donuts store under a different franchisee, he expected nothing but perfection from me and placed me on a shift with a coworker that had even more experience than me, 5 years, but he had warned me about that employee and said that I would be expected to, quote, pick up slack, unquote. Is a shift leader, and I was hired as a crew member, so Mr. put his faith in me to essentially do all the work that my immediate supervisor would not do. I had accepted this without problem, as I am the type of worker that managers usually expect to carry more than my own share of the workload. I do, however, have difficulty in accepting when a crew of 5 to 7 employees, with Mr. present, failed to do any of their duties and leave their entire workload for the next shift to cover, in addition to the long list of duties my own shift needs to do before the store closes. I made countless attempts to try and drive home the point to Mr. that the more work the first shift left for us to do, the harder it was for us to accomplish our own duties in between customers. Mr. reaction to our discussions always centered around 4 specific points. A. Second shift had less business, so there was no reason why we couldn't do everything first shift left for us. B. Our method of working was inefficient and the 2 of us must do everything the way the first shift does. 2 of us would have to be in 5 different places at the same time. C. We had no right to complain about anything unless we were perfect. And D. Our drive-through times were not within his goal, which was a full 30 seconds faster than Dunkin' Donuts requires, and that these were our problems that we needed to address immediately. Failure to accomplish this, whether or not it was actually our fault, resulted in arbitrary reduction of scheduled hours. Both Mr. and I have received multiple nasty text messages in the morning for things we had forgotten to do. One specific example of such is when we had inadvertently forgotten to move bagels from the freezer to the refrigerator, a duty that belongs to first shift. It was our unofficial responsibility to check and make sure others had done their jobs. As warmer weather approached in 2016 and business increased, and I expressed to Mr. that we could benefit greatly from having 1 additional employee scheduled until early evening when our evening surge subsided. These requests were useless. Mr. said that business was actually dropping and that we were, quote, making it up, unquote, because we were, quote, lazy and didn't want to work, unquote. As I was the one that counted both registers down at the end of the night, I can say with 100% certainty that our business increased dramatically. An average shift would have a cash drop of $175 to $225, and many days the cash drops were $300 to $450. This is proof that our sales doubled on many days. Mr. was accurate about sales dropping on second shift, but he overlooked one major detail. The only nights where sales dropped were on nights that worked with another employee who was 17 years old. I mention her now because she comes into play a bit later. Often I would come in as a customer on my days off, and would complain about I had been, quote, dead, unquote, the whole day. Even you'll notice that business was slower when worked, but much busier when he and I worked. One would certainly think Mr. would be able to tell the difference, but apparently he was unable to see this, or chose not to see it. I do not recall the date of the first actual write-up I received while there. I am guessing it was April, since our store does not have the ability to give employees copies of write-ups or employee manuals or anything else. The first write-up was due to having some sort of issue with me, but it had not come to Mr. attention until nearly a month later, and could not remember what I had allegedly done. In most employment establishments, you cannot issue a write-up to an employee that long after a complaint, and you definitely cannot discipline someone for something that the complainant cannot even recall. It is my opinion that, whatever it wasn't serious enough to remember, and therefore most likely insignificant or invented. Especially coming from someone who would publicly proclaim, quote, I wish would just fire me already and get it over with. I hate working here. The sooner he fires me, the sooner I can go get a better job, unquote. Be that as it may, I was pressured to sign the write-up, which provides no area for an employee response, because Mr. said, if you don't sign it, you can't work until you do, unquote. He essentially used my financial situation as leverage to get me to sign something that I didn't agree with, and something that couldn't be proven or even identified. The explanation for the write-up was very vague. Quote, negativity in the workplace towards employees and customers, unquote. It is interesting to see the hypocrisy in that phrase. Mr. is known for his extremely short temper and verbal and physical abuse towards employees, to the point where even customers have observed that abuse. On 3 occasions that I know of, Mr. has thrown full cups of hot coffee at employees and then forced them to clean up his mess in full view of our patrons. He seems to be projecting his negativity onto me, and that is certainly unfair and immature. Being that I had learned, by this point, there was a very obvious double standard between the 2 shifts, I stopped trying to fight for equal treatment and accepted the fact that I would always be expected to be shouldering most of the workload. I kept my mouth shut and my head down and continued to push myself. I worked harder than most of the staff there, cultivated positive relationships with my regular customers, impressed new customers, and frequently received customer compliments for my attitude, personality, and manners. Sadly, there is a major issue with the customer service satisfaction surveys, as customers filled out positive surveys that we never received recognition for because they never, quote, got through the system, unquote, to where Mr. would receive them. All my hard work wasn't apparent to Mr. because these surveys were never sent to him, and even some of the surveys he filled out for himself and his own crew never got sent to him. It might even be suggested that all the positive customer surveys he fills out for himself are what helped earn his new promotion. On June 12, 2016, Mr. sent me a text message asking me to come in earlier than my shift because they needed the coverage. I responded as soon as I woke up for the day and reported to work early. He immediately took me into his office to administer 2 more write-ups, one for something I had posted on Facebook that did not mention him, the workplace, the company, or customers by name. It was done in anger, I will not deny. I was very upset that, once again, my hours had been slashed. After deductions for taxes and medical insurance, I would barely have enough money to survive the week, and paying bills was definitely out of the question. I was also facing my mother's impending layoff from her job, so I was under a great deal of stress at the time. The first write-up was specifically pertaining to my use of social media to vent my frustrations. Apparently there is a policy regarding this that I was not, and still am not, aware of because employees receive no handbook. The second write-up was clearly an outright lie. There was no way to sugarcoat it. Mr. accused me of deliberately messing up customers' coffees to ruin the store's reputation. He said he received complaints daily about, quote, the tall, skinny guy with glasses, unquote, of which we had 3 at the time, and supposedly the complaints had been dating back all the way to my date of hire. And he also said that I made a habit out of, quote, cussing out customers while they were placing orders at the speaker, unquote. I was totally in shock by this revelation, and inquired as to why he waited 10 months to tell me that I had so many complaints. He told me it didn't matter why, that he was sick of hearing about it, and that he had to think about his own job and the, quote, way I was portraying not only Dunkin' Donuts, but also, unquote, and that I was single-handedly, quote, making him look bad, unquote, and, quote, driving customers from the store, unquote, with my attitude. Mr. then informed me that I would be finishing out the week as scheduled, and after that I would no longer be employed. The discussion was complete. The decision had already been made prior to the write-ups being issued and before I had set foot in the store that day, so I began working my shift. A few minutes later, definitely less than 5 minutes, he called me to the back again to inform me that I had to leave the store, quote, now, as in like immediately, clock out, you're done here, unquote. So I clocked out, retaining my clock out receipt showing I had worked 0.42 hours, of which I did not get paid for, and returned home. I filled out my partial unemployment claim for that week, choosing the option that I had been discharged, since he told me I was terminated. Having been through the unemployment process several times, I knew that I had no defense other than my word versus Mr. word, and knowing how liberally the phrase, unquote, or, quote, willful misconduct, unquote, is defined, I had already decided the DOL and would interpret Mr. mistruths as deliberate actions on my part, and opted not to call and fight for benefits. Most recently, however, I have come to know information that is relevant and encourages me to fight for my unemployment benefits. Fast forward nearly a month to July 12, 2016. My mother and I entered the Dunkin' Donuts store for coffees and asked to have a few words with us. So we obliged, and at that point my entire world turned upside down. In actuality, I had not been terminated. My status with the company is still active. I simply do not have a store to go to and no schedule to work. I believe this is done specifically so that the employee goes elsewhere for work and can then be defined as having quit their job and not that they were fired. Mr. has let his favoritism for select employees shine through, and for me to have the audacity to expect equal treatment was apparently too much for him to bear, enough to the point where he has invented scenarios to give him the justification to get rid of me. The falsehoods of verbal abuse of customers and deliberate ruining of customers' coffees were just the right type of lies to support a willful misconduct defense. But what really astonishes me is the blatant lie that I had been fired when his very own general manager has provided me with the truth, that Mr. couldn't fire me as he was in the process of being promoted and was within the 2-week hold on all hirings and firings, a policy has in place specifically to prevent this type of vindictive action, and therefore not technically allowed to do so. To conclude, the reasons for which I was let go but not terminated were wholly manufactured by a manager that was lashing out emotionally, a man that just weeks before telling me to leave threatened to quit if he wasn't promoted, a man who told me I was terminated when I was not, a man that placed more responsibility and had higher expectations for me than he did himself and his chosen favorites. One of the most interesting things I can say at this time is that I have had 7 regular customers approach me in public and ask why I hadn't been at work lately, because they had not been able to get a properly made coffee since the day I was told to leave. When I explained what happened, they shook their heads in disbelief. 2 of them said they would boycott that store simply because I was, quote, one of the best employees has ever hired, unquote, and this is from his former assistant manager, and she had quit because she couldn't handle Mr. lies and abuse.